Have you ever raised your voice at your dog and then immediately felt the need to apologize? What does it say about a person who feels genuine remorse for upsetting an animal? Is it an overreaction, or is something far more psychologically revealing quietly happening in that moment? What if apologizing to your dog after getting angry is one of the most emotionally intelligent things you do? What if that apology tells us more about your character than almost anything else you do all day? And what if the person who apologizes to their dog is, in a very specific sense, someone worth knowing? There is a specific kind of guilt that dog owners know intimately, not the guilt of doing something morally serious, but the quiet, sudden guilt of realizing you upset someone who only ever loves you. Maybe you snapped when they would not stop barking. Maybe you spoke sharply when they jumped on you for the 5th time. Maybe you simply had a terrible day, and they were there, and some of it came out. And then you saw their face, the slight recoil, the lowered head, the careful way they checked if you were still safe. Something in you, something immediate and genuine needed to make it right. From the outside, apologizing to a dog might look eccentric, but from inside the psychology of that moment, something profoundly revealing is taking place, something that speaks to who this person is. Psychologists who study moral emotion and the human-animal bond have examined what happens when people feel and express remorse toward their animals. And what they have found is deeply affirming. The person who apologizes to their dog is demonstrating a specific cluster of moral and emotional capacities that are genuinely rare and genuinely worth having. Understanding this behavior, what it means, why it happens, and what it reveals about the person is worth examining carefully and without condescension. The question worth asking is not whether apologizing to a dog is rational. The deeper question is what this behavior reveals about the person and what it tells us about their moral world. What is it that makes a person feel remorse toward an animal? Is it empathy, moral sensitivity, a discomfort with having allowed their anger to land somewhere undeserved? What does the apology itself mean? When a person kneels beside their dog, speaks softly, says "I'm sorry," even knowing the dog cannot understand the words, what is happening inside that person? Is the apology primarily for the dog, or is it also in some meaningful sense for the person a way of closing the loop, restoring coherence between who they believe they are and how they just behaved? For many people who apologize to their dogs, the apology is restorative, the act through which a person returns to the self they want to be, and just briefly, under pressure, or not. Moral emotion. The family of emotional states arising from perceived moral violations includes guilt, shame, remorse, and regret. These belong to the same family but function quite differently. Guilt arises when a person believes their behavior harmed another, violated their own values, or departed from the kind of person they intend to be. This expanded moral concern is not sentimentality. It is the hallmark of a person who can recognize suffering across the boundaries most people draw around their empathy. What makes the dog owner's guilt particularly interesting is that it extends across the species boundary, applying a moral framework not to another human being, but to an animal. This reflects what psychologists call moral circle expansion, the widening of the set of beings whose welfare is treated as morally relevant and worth protecting. Research shows that people with wider moral circles, those extending genuine moral concern beyond their species, show higher levels of empathy, compassion, and prosocial behavior generally. The person who feels guilty about upsetting their dog is demonstrating a moral architecture that is genuinely expansive, one that takes the feelings of vulnerable beings seriously. When the person sees the dog's response to their anger, the recoil, the lowered head, the cautious eyes, the anterior cingulate cortex activates. This is the brain's error detection center. The anterior cingulate detects a mismatch between intended behavior and actual behavior. It is, neurologically speaking, the seat of conscience, the region that registers that something important has gone wrong. This activation produces a specific, aversive, emotional signal that something important has been violated. And crucially, this signal motivates corrective action. The apology is not just about what happened with the dog. It is about restoring the self, refusing to be the kind of person who causes harm, and simply moves on. The person kneels, the person pets the dog, the person speaks gently. These are the corrective actions, the behaviors that close the loop the anterior cingulate has opened. Self-discrepancy theory argues that emotional distress arises when a person perceives a gap between their actual self, how they are behaving, and their ideal self, how they intend to be. For the person who prides themselves on being gentle and loving toward their dog, a moment of anger creates a significant self-discrepancy. The guilt and the apology are both responses to this gap. The apology is a self-repair act, a way of narrowing the gap between actual and ideal self, reasserting the values that the angry moment temporarily violated. The guilt that leads to the apology is, At its core, empathic, arising from the person's capacity to perceive and be moved by the dog's emotional state. When the person sees the dog's recoil, something in them feels it. The dog's distress is registered not just intellectually, but somatically in the body, as its own form of pain. Psychologists distinguish between cognitive empathy, understanding how another feels, and affective empathy, actually feeling it in one's own body. The guilt and apology sequence is driven by affective empathy. Affective empathy is what makes the apology feel urgent. The person does not reason their way to remorse, they feel their way there. The dog's distress registers in their nervous system, and the response is immediate. There is also something important about the specific quality of the dog's response to anger. The dog does not become defensive. The dog does not retaliate. The dog does not hold the anger against the person. The dog becomes careful. The dog watches to see if the person is safe again. This vulnerability, the lack of any defensive resource, is part of what makes the guilt so acute. Seeing that vulnerability, knowing they caused it, and knowing the dog has no recourse and no ability to protect itself, this is what transforms ordinary regret into the urgent, physical need to apologize and repair. In this way, the dog becomes something unexpected, not just a companion, but a mirror for the person's own moral life, reflecting back what they have just done. The guilt is also sharpened by the disproportion of the relationship. The dog has given everything loyalty, love, uncritical joy, and the person, momentarily, gave anger. That disproportion is felt acutely. Now let us look at what happens in the body during this sequence, from the angry moment, through the guilt, to the apology. This is not just a psychological experience, it is physiological. Anger is a high arousal state. Cortisol and adrenaline spike, heart rate increases, the body mobilizes. And then when the target is the dog, a beloved and vulnerable being, something shifts rapidly. The parasympathetic nervous system begins to reassert itself. The dog's distress activates neural circuitry associated with empathy and social bonding circuits that conflict directly with the arousal of anger. This neurological conflict between anger, arousal, and the empathic response to the dog's distress is what produces the guilt. The two systems are simultaneously active, and the empathic system begins to win. As the person moves toward the dog and the apology begins, oxytocin rises. The softening of the voice, the physical contact, the act of repair, all promote oxytocin release in both person and dog. Cortisol drops, the heart rate slows. The body, mobilized for anger, is now moving toward connection and repair, and the physiological experience of this shift is itself profound. The apology is the moment the human nervous system completes a cycle from threat to response to restoration. The dog, in receiving the apology, completes its own cycle, from distress to safety. Research using neuroimaging has shown that genuine guilt, as opposed to shame, activates regions associated with empathy and prosocial motivation. This distinction is neurologically significant. Genuine guilt drives repair. It is functionally different from shame, which drives concealment. The person who apologizes to their dog is in the guilt state, and that is the morally and neurologically healthier place to be. A person who responds to moral failures with guilt-driven repair is healthier and more capable of genuine accountability than a person who responds with shame-driven concealment. The apology to the dog is the expression of a fully functioning moral-emotional system doing what it was designed to do: detect harm, feel remorse, and restore the relationship. The anterior cingulate cortex, activated by error detection, quiets when the corrective action is taken. The loop closes. The distress resolves. The apology is not just an expression, it is a resolution. This resolution is its own reward. The nervous system registers the repair as successful and releases a small cascade of positive neurochemicals. The person who apologizes to their dog does not just make amends, they feel better. This feeling better is not the satisfaction of performed virtue. It is the quieter relief of having honored one's own values, in private, of being who one wants to be when no one is watching. Now let us talk about what the apology reveals about the person's relationship with their dog, because guilt and repair are only possible in the context of a specific kind of bond. The guilt presupposes care. A person cannot feel remorse about upsetting a being they do not care for. The depth of the guilt is, in this way, a direct measure of the depth of the love. For many people, the relationship with their dog is among the most emotionally significant in their lives, characterized by unconditional love, consistent presence, and non-judgmental warmth. This is a complete moral-emotional cycle, and the person who moves through it naturally and consistently, with a dog as their interlocutor, is practicing something genuinely important. When anger disrupts a space that has been defined by love, the disruption is felt acutely. The apology is the act of restoring what was momentarily disturbed. There is also the power differential. The person holds all structural power. The dog is entirely dependent for food, for shelter, for safety, for the emotional quality of their days. That power differential creates a specific moral obligation. The person who recognizes that their anger lands differently on a dependent being who cannot protect itself is engaging in genuine moral reasoning. The apology acknowledges that moral obligation. It says, "I hold power here, and I used it carelessly. That is not acceptable to me." That acknowledgement is a form of moral integrity. The dog has never broken faith. The dog has never answered anger with anger. This consistent fidelity makes the person's momentary anger feel more wrong, and the need to repair it more urgent. There is also the matter of what the dog represents. The dog often represents the most reliable, consistent, and uncomplicated source of love in the person's life. When a person damages that, even with a word, even with a tone, they are damaging the thing they most rely on. The urgency of the repair reflects the depth of that reliance. For some people, the apology is also self-examination. The moment of anger, its appearance, its target, its intensity, reveals something about what is happening inside the person. The act of apologizing forces a micro-moment of accountability, a small reckoning with the fact that difficult day, accumulated stress, and unprocessed emotion found expression in a way the person does not endorse. This accountability, small, private, directed at a dog, is still accountability. The person who holds themselves accountable in small, private moments holds themselves accountable in larger, more visible ones too. Now let us consider the types of people who apologize to their dogs after getting angry. The behavior is common among deeply bonded dog owners, but the psychology beneath it varies meaningfully. There is the high standard holder, someone who holds themselves to elevated expectations, particularly in their closest relationships. Any departure from their own ideal is felt intensely. What the apology does, ultimately, is restore coherence between self and behavior. And maintaining that coherence, even in small and private moments, is what moral integrity actually requires. The high standard holder's guilt is sharp because the gap between ideal and actual behavior is large. They expect a great deal of themselves, and the dog is the relationship where that gap is most clearly felt. Then there is the repaired person, someone who has done significant work on themselves and become aware of their anger patterns. When anger surfaces, the guilt carries extra weight. For the repaired person, the angry moment is evidence that the work is ongoing, that old patterns still live beneath the new ones. The apology to the dog is also an apology to their own progress. There is the overflow expressor, someone who manages emotions carefully in every other context and rarely shows their inner state. With their dog, the containment sometimes fails. The overflow expressor's guilt comes from recognizing that their dog absorbs what other people are protected from, that the dog, by being safe, receives everything they are not safe to feel elsewhere. There is the high empathy type, someone whose empathic response to the dog's distress is so immediate that guilt arrives almost before the anger has fully subsided. For them, the apology is almost reflexive. The high empathy type does not deliberate. They see the dog's face and feel the urgency of repair. Their moral emotional system operates at speed empathic calculation, almost simultaneous with the perception of harm. And there is the accountability practitioner, someone who has organized their life around the value of taking responsibility, who has learned that genuine accountability, practiced consistently, is the foundation of integrity. For the accountability practitioner, the apology to the dog is entirely consistent with how they move through every relationship. The dog is not a special case, simply another being to whom they owe honesty. Now, let us go somewhere deeper. For many people who apologize to their dogs, the behavior is not just about the present relationship. It connects to something older, formed earlier in emotional development. Think about the child who experienced anger in their home, a parent's anger, directed at them, that was never followed by apology or repair. The anger happened, the harm was never addressed. That child learned something about anger and about relationships, that rupture does not automatically lead to repair, that love disrupted by anger simply continues, unaddressed. What these types share is a specific relationship between their values and their behavior, a relationship in which a gap between the two is not tolerable. Many adults who apologize to their dogs are, in part, rejecting that lesson, refusing to be the person who delivers anger without repair. The apology is an intergenerational refusal. It says, "That is not how I will do this. Whatever I received, I will not pass forward. In this small, private moment, I will be different." There is also the child who was the target of disproportionate anger, who experienced adult frustration at an intensity wildly inconsistent with what they had done. That child knows what it is like. They know what it is like to be the small recipient of a large emotion, to have no recourse. When they see the same expression on their dog's face, they know, and they cannot let it stand. The empathy they have for the dog is, in part, empathy for the child they once were, the child who never got the apology, but who deserved one. Researchers who study moral development have observed that the capacity for guilt-driven repair is one of the strongest predictors of long-term relational and moral health. The person who apologizes to their dog is genuinely practicing this capacity. The dog cannot evaluate or reward the performance, and what we practice privately is what we become. Now let us step back and consider what apologizing to dogs reveals about the kind of people who do it, and about what moral intelligence actually looks like in daily, private, unobserved life. It looks like this the moment after anger, when no one is watching and no reward exists for doing right, and the person does it anyway, because the dog deserves it. If you apologize to your dog after getting angry, if you feel that guilt and that urgency to repair, you are not being oversensitive. You are demonstrating a sophisticated and genuinely rare moral capacity. You are someone who extends genuine moral concern beyond the socially obligated minimum, who takes accountability in private moments, whose values do not go offline when no one important is watching. If this resonated, please like it and subscribe. And in the comments, tell us, what does your apology to your dog look like, and how does it feel when they forgive you, as they always do?